All right, so welcome to Automation Study Group. Today, our final Azure DevOps mini bootcamp session with Mike Steers, and he will do a recap of all other sessions, as well as give you a tip for Azure DevOps exam. Mike, go ahead.
Awesome. Yep. So, hey everyone, welcome back. Session 6. Just a reminder, the whole goal of this mini bootcamp was to, of course, share information about Azure DevOps with everyone. We were trying to touch on every single aspect or every single feature that Azure DevOps offers. I wasn't familiar with all of them, so it was a good way to force myself to learn it, because the best way I learn is by demonstrating it to someone else. So it's been fun. Thanks everyone for attending and watching the videos. I hope we make a ton of money on our YouTube channel. And the other goal with this was so that we could be prepared for passing the AZ400 exam. I cheated a little bit, not on the exam, but I took the exam a couple of weeks ago instead of waiting until the end of this. So I thought a good way to finish it would be to recap everything that we talked about and talk about how it applies to the exam. So feel free to ask questions about the exam. I'm not sure what I can say, but it was definitely one of the weirdest certification exams that I've ever took. So what we covered was all of these topics, the development process, CI, CD. We spent a lot of time on that. We talked about Azure Boards, which was probably my weakest area. And there was a lot of focus on the process around managing projects in Azure DevOps on the exam. So if you're not familiar with that, I'd recommend putting a little bit of extra time into that. Continuous feedback, we talked about test plans last week. I think we're going to have another demo on test plans, just like an extra one later on. And then we had a few cleanup topics at the end, which was DevOps strategy and application infrastructure. The strategy is about the exam, but the application infrastructure, it was one of the areas of focus on the exam description, but I don't even know what to say about it. There's like, I wanted this to cover a more development side of the exam, thinking that we would have all sorts of questions about like development practices and things related to coding. So we started this out with a project that was a web app running on app service. And I thought maybe if I force myself to learn some C#, I'll have to like learn some more specifics about how development processes fit into the exam. And it didn't really seem to matter. I mean, what we'll review is the areas that I thought were relevant, and the good news is what we covered seemed to be good enough. But as for application infrastructure, it was almost like it was just understood or expected that you had a good grasp of Azure in general. So that, as vague as that sounds, application infrastructure on the exam objectives pretty much just means you know how to deploy infrastructure that you'll be hosting your application on. I know that sounds obvious, but I really thought there was going to be something more to it. So, if you know how to deploy VNets, storage accounts, all that stuff, and configure them properly, that's basically the infrastructure that's being used for your application, and just general knowledge of it is good enough. And all the things that we accomplished over the past 5 sessions, we built and deployed a .NET Core app service. We put all that into a repo, and we started using Azure Boards to manage some bugs and features. We didn't really get to develop the application at all, other than changing a few banners, but that's all right. We can't be successful at everything. I didn't learn anything about C#. Oh well, maybe next time. Then we talked about CI/CD processes with both the classic and the YAML pipelines. We talked about test plans last week, and now we're going to go into the last topic, which was DevOps Server scenarios, and then we'll go a little bit into a demo of all the areas that we talked about. So DevOps Server, this is the slide I have for it, because Lord only knows what you can really say about this. I tried to come up with a compelling list of comparison features between Azure DevOps and DevOps Server and when you would want to use it, and it all kind of just came down to, do you need your DevOps processes to be on-prem? the features between DevOps Server and Azure DevOps, they seem like they're identical. The only difference I could find was that there's a release cadence of 3 months for DevOps Server, because obviously there's like installers and all that stuff. And with Azure DevOps, you get features released pretty much at the end of every sprint for the DevOps server, for the Azure DevOps team. So scenarios where you would want your DevOps processes hosted on-prem, they kind of, and even still, like when I give these examples, you can kind of accomplish them in Azure DevOps. So one example would be that organization policy says that you can't keep your code in a repository that's hosted in the cloud. Even though we know how to secure our repos now in Azure DevOps, maybe it's just like a policy that says, no, sorry, all code must remain on-prem. There's a good use for Azure DevOps Server. But on the other hand, you can still link Azure DevOps to an on-prem code repository like Enterprise Git, or who knows, tons of them, but you can totally do that. So then it now comes down to what else needs to be hosted on-prem. If the main concern about is code, we got that covered with Azure DevOps. What about our build agents? Remember, we talked about those virtual machines or containers that are running all the processes around putting your application into CI and CD. Well, if you don't use the self-hosted agents, as we learned, you can, or the Microsoft-hosted agents, you can have your own self-hosted agents, and you can put those agents on-prem and run them as a VM in your VMware or Hyper-V. So that's kind of okay too. So that just leaves us with the automation of the pipelines, like the actual management, not the containers that are running the automation. And it leaves us with Azure Artifacts, which you don't really need to use. You can keep them in your build pipeline, but this one might be key here, because if you have your artifacts output to your build, those would still reside in the cloud. So I think that might be a key differentiator between the two. And Azure Artifacts, of course, that one is also stored in the cloud. So your build outputs, that seems to be the one that's going to be like, if you can't store it, the output of your pipelines in the cloud, then that's my most compelling reason for using Azure DevOps Server. I guess the other one would be boards, keeping track of your sprints and stuff like that. I mean, you can secure it, but that one is completely hosted in Azure, or Azure DevOps Server. So what we'll cover for the AZ400 is just a quick recap of everything that we did in the previous session. So we'll jump through all of these in a second. One thing I did want to talk about, because the boards section was my weakest, is the Agile versus Scrum. In the session that we talked about with this, I said, I can't figure out what the difference is between Agile and Scrum. I know one is a methodology and the other is a process, but when it comes down to ADO, it still seems like the only differentiator here is the terminology. So you saw this slide before, but you'll notice that it's just a different terminology, but the same kind of structure for all of your work items and stories in the Azure boards. So instead of a user story, we got a product backlog item, and instead of an issue or a bug, we have an impediment. Like, it's just a little bit different, and when you set your boards or you set your project style up, it will be, that's pretty much the only difference I could find. Now, there were a lot of questions on the exam related around the management of your projects in the Agile process. So I can't give anything specific about what to focus on here, other than how I felt comfortable with taking the exam was I kept trying to find out what the difference is between Agile and Scrum. And I just kept trying to dig deeper and deeper and find how it related to Azure DevOps. And after about 2 hours of, I wouldn't say wasting my time because it turned out valuable, but 2 hours of just like clicking around, it gave me like a good appreciation of what the differences are from a process perspective. And you'll need to know those processes when you're taking that exam. But when it comes down to the functionality of Azure DevOps, it looks like it's just a difference of terminology, because even the work items, they look identical, just with different field names for specific areas. And I probably should have taken this slide out, but it was just a reminder to myself to really nail down that a lot of the focus of that exam was around boards. So knowing how to plan for capacity, how to set sprints or iterations, and knowing the difference between all of the different types of work items like in epics and stories and all of that stuff, it came in really handy. This is one of the reasons why I thought the exam was pretty weird. I thought it was going to be a lot of technical things, and while there was, the process stuff, there's not really a lot of talk about process on the other certifications, so it's good to know. So let's jump into a quick recap of what we did. So I'm going to switch this back to our classic pipelines because that's where we started. All right, so in our pipelines, we started with a classic build and a classic release pipeline. In here, the types of things you're going to want to know and how they related to applications and development, which is the area that I wasn't as comfortable with, was what to do with a package, an application that you need to put somewhere. And knowing the .NET Publish agent task seemed to be good enough to get a grasp of what would be expected if you're developing pipelines and you have to deliver an application. So this .NET Publish, remember, it was taking our Hello World app written in C#, and it just checked it, make sure all the dependencies were okay, outputted a zip file, and we published it to our artifact. So when we publish this one, we publish it as a build artifact. Knowing the difference between build artifacts and Azure artifacts is definitely key. So your build artifacts, they're going to exist within the build only. So we'll look at a previous build of this classic one. And your artifacts are up here. So here's that zip file that we created that contained our web app. And the templates zip file is just the, I guess we'll call it the application infrastructure. So it was our VNets and our whatever else it was we deployed to get our web app running. When you're going over to Azure Artifacts, however, we put them in here. And the versioning on this, you'll notice, is different. So we have version 0.0.25, so we get some management around which version increments we want to change and how many versions we want to remember or keep in our Azure artifacts. Whereas with the classic, we had it's only accessible within that build pipeline, and the version number is the commit tag from when you committed your changes to the repository and the build was executed. The good thing again about Azure Artifacts is you get the ability to manage your retention policy. So down here, we can say how many versions of it do we want to keep and how long do we want to keep them. Talked about upstream sources. So if you're sharing your Azure artifacts with other people in your Azure DevOps organization, they can connect to your artifacts feed and have it as an upstream source. The reason why you would want to do that is, let's say your package management retention policy is a little bit too aggressive for the other teams that are consuming your artifacts. So what it would do is when they connect to your upstream feed, when they're deploying their applications, they'll choose which version they want, it will cache it, and then it will keep it there according to their retention policy. So the source artifact feed, though that artifact could be gone, and the one that's connected will keep the one that they most recently deployed or whatever their retention policy allows. One interesting thing that we learned about the artifact feeds and using upstream sources, we had no use for it in our project because you'll notice when we had Azure Artifacts as our output, we were using universal packages. And when you're connecting to an upstream source, there's no such concept of only using universal packages. So the upstreams and the Azure Artifacts really do still seem like they're built around developers developing applications and not so much the infrastructure for your project. Maybe it'll be a feature in the future, but the reason you see these is because they have more integration into Visual Studio. So a developer who's coding something, an actual application, they would connect their NuGet gallery inside Visual Studio, and they'd be able to consume their artifact packages that way. There's no real way to do that in Visual Studio with universal packages, and universal was always kind of like a catch-all, throw all your junk here that doesn't fit into the other areas. So one thing to be aware of, universal is not available in the upstream. So once we had our classic build pipeline, we went over to a classic release pipeline. And inside here, it was a very similar UI. We had our stages, which would have been our environments, dev, UAT, prod kind of scenario, and we connected our artifact here, and this one was a build artifact. And this is where we deployed our templates. Nothing too fancy here. Here's the application infrastructure, and here's the delivery of the application. Hooray. That was fun, but nobody uses Classic anymore. So then we switched over to the preview feature, which I still kind of question whether or not it's actually in preview. We did a DevOps bootcamp a week ago, and a lot of people who were new to created their very first DevOps org, multi-stage pipelines was already enabled. So maybe this is just, you know, a UI thing where these are the only things that you can, the only way to turn it on and off, but whatever, we switched over to multi-stage. In multi-stage, it switches this icon over here from builds over to just pipelines, because now we're going to do our build and our release all in one location, and we're going to do it in a way more unfriendly way by editing YAML files. So we created two pipelines, one for dev and one for production. Arguably, this is not the best way to do it because it's a duplication of code. We'll take a look at the dev pipeline. Oh, maybe I deleted it. Let's take a look at the prod one. Here we go. So the dev and the prod pipeline are exactly the same. The only thing that we changed was this environment, and we'll get into that in 1 second. So looking at these pipeline YAML files, they're very finicky. The spacing is super critical, and editing them without this interface becomes a little bit tedious and prone to error, because when you're editing the YAML pipeline directly in this pipeline's button or whatever, you get access to these tasks, and it helps you build all of these specific tasks here, so you don't need to know the YAML schema and the task parameters. If you go and edit this in your repo and you just open the file, you don't get any of this help. And this little settings button up above each task will jump you over to a UI that helps you build these out. So what we did in this one was we set up multiple stages. We did our build stage, and we took that classic task, the publishing of our .NET application, and we ran .NET, outputted this to an artifact staging directory on those build agents, and we named our artifact this way. Then we published it, and instead of using the build pipeline, we used the task for universal packages, which put us into Azure Artifacts on the left side. Pretty much similar to the build artifact task, except now we get this destination feed and we get to name what our package is here. So you just get like a couple extra parameters that you have to fill in. And we did the same thing with our templates. Made an artifact for it. Sure, we could have done it all in one artifact, but whatever. We were just playing around, and this is probably the best way to do it anyway. After that, now we went into stage validation. Remembering on the old classic way, a stage was kind of considered an environment. Here, a stage is just like a significant process has completed in the pipeline and we're moving on to the next one. So it's where we want to make sure that all the other steps were successful before we start on something else. So we went into build, which was, what was build? Oh yeah, it was our validation stage. We took our artifact, which had our Azure templates for deploy and parameters, and then instead of doing it in the incremental mode, we just chose validate. Made sure that our templates were cool. I mean, it's good enough. It could be better. Side note, the could be better, I guess, would be a little bit more in-depth testing to see what would happen if we actually did try to deploy that. And there's a cool new feature coming. It's in preview right now with ARM templates. If you haven't seen the Ignite video, I'll paste it into the chat later. But there's a new validation kind of mode with deploying an ARM template where you can test what the actual changes to the destination environment will be. So it'll tell you if you're deploying this template and it's already been deployed and you changed, say, I don't know, you removed a subnet or something, it'll tell you before you deploy it, these are all the changes that are going to happen when you deploy. So if that feature was available, we would probably put that into our validation stage as well. Then we moved on to deploy, and this is where environments came in. We just did the exact same thing as the validation, except we changed our deployment mode of the templates to incremental. Everything went out, awesome. And then we had a deployment again into, that was an error where it says dev, but whatever. We deployed our web app, and it was the universal package, and it was setting the location for the zip file from our web app artifact. So aside from the fact that we made a mistake here and we have dev and prod as the environment, so since we're in the production pipeline, what we did for dev was we just copied this and then we pasted it into another pipeline, and then we probably changed the environments to just say dev. That's kind of ugly. What we should have probably done is up here, set a variable and pass that in so we could just use the same pipeline and just set the pipeline variable instead of having a duplicate of it. So what happens when you set an environment? Turning on multi-stage gave us this environments tab. So this is where we can now, this is the equivalent of the classic where we saw all those stages that we considered environments. Now there's actually an actual location for environments and where you can monitor the deployment process across all of your environments. So we didn't really get too far. I think it looks like we left our deployments in a failed state because we were probably messing around with something. But now you can kind of just get a general idea of where your deployments are. In the classic one, when you were setting approvals, you would just go into the stage and say, here's the people who need to approve something. But when you're actually using environments now, you can click into the environment, and up here you have your approvals and checks. So it's a little bit hidden, I guess. It doesn't seem as obvious. If we look at this release, the classic one, in here was pre-deployment approvals. It seemed a little bit more obvious where to go, and you can set who's going to approve your deployment. So what was the whole point of this? Like, why pipelines in YAML? And the main reason is that you now have your pipeline in code. In Classic, it was just a bunch of clicks. If you had access to change the pipeline, you could. There was no code review of it. You could trace the history of what was changed, but YAML pipelines gives us, it follows the code review process. Let's review what that code review process was. We talked about branching. You want to know branching strategy for the exam for sure, because there's going to be scenarios where you need to kind of decide, like, what's the best approach for managing a repo. So let's go to branches. And where did it go? Branch security. So, sorry, branching policies. So we talked about branching and like what's the proper way to name your branches, and there's all sorts of different ways. But we were saying, you know, don't commit directly to master. Create another branch, be it called feature branch with your name on it, or feature / with your name, or maybe the branch is named after your team. Whatever it is, committing to master seems to be considered a sin. So what you want to do with these policies is, let's say you're managing that YAML pipeline and you want to go through a code review process. Someone develops it, makes a change on the development branch. Now, whenever the master tries to do a deployment to production, it won't do it with the YAML file that you're working on. That has to go through this code review process, which is when you're merging, you require automatic approvers. You can set those people there so there's someone always looking at that file before it gets merged into master. And you can require a certain number of people to review it as well. What else did we do? Let's see. Test plans, I still kind of don't quite understand them, but Claudia has been trying to explain them to me for, I think, 2 months now, and I still don't quite get how to use them effectively. The scenario that we were hoping to accomplish here was to create a test plan in Visual Studio that would check the functionality of our application that we deployed. So I know this is possible. How to do it, can't quite tell you exactly, but the idea was the web app would deploy, and then the Azure test plans, which would execute a test plan that's something you develop inside Visual Studio. It's like a feature of Visual Studio. It would get published here, and it would kind of in the background with some magic browser thing and an agent somewhere that it would go to your website and it would click on all the things that you wanted it to click on. Click on buy. Does it bring you to the shopping cart? Does it show this specific word in the shopping cart? Like those kinds of tests are what you can execute here. That's what I was hoping to do. Knowing enough about what test plans are, though, seems to be, just knowing the concept seems to be good enough. But I definitely have some work to do here. And then what else did we do? Talked about repos, branching strategies, commits. Yeah, definitely know the Git basics. We talked about branching, how to make commits, how to add your changes, how to stage them, how to change the origin URL of your repo if you cloned it from somewhere else. Knowledge around tracking changes, looking at the history of all your commits and knowing how to revert them. That's definitely helpful. So right here, we went into this commit and we wanted to change it back. You go up to the commit, top right, and revert it. Tagging, we added some items around tagging. The way you want to use tagging, there's probably a lot of ways, but when you reach, like, say, a major milestone in your code and you want to say this is version 2.0, you could throw a tag on your commit and say 2.0, and that way when you're pulling down your code and say it's not, you don't want to store it as an artifact and you don't want to store it as an Azure artifact, you can always just change the version, change the clone command in your code build that says, I want to start with the code from the repo that has the tag 2.0. That way you can always go back through the history and just keep building with a specific version while development processes keep going on. That's the best scenario I could come up with tags. I've seen some other people use tags as just like a way to comment things for their team, like, hey, I did this today and it made this break or something like that. In pull requests, that was where we were merging our branches when we were ready to get our code merged into master. And when do you merge into master? You only merge into master when you're confident that your code is going to work, because master is always considered a working copy of your application or your code. What else did we do? Let's see. I think that's all we did. So we have some next sessions coming up. I'll probably do them in maybe March or April. We're going to focus around code blocks. Code blocks is a cool little concept that we've been working on, where all of your infrastructure as code is separated into like already pre-built nice modules, kind of like Azure Quick Start templates, but with all sorts of stuff built in that's really cool, like built-in unit testing, built-in validation, with pester testing, and all the deployment and YAML scripts are already written for you. So it's just kind of a matter of putting the blocks together. So they're called code blocks. We'll talk about those coming up. A lot of talk around GitHub and actions, GitHub Actions, sorry. We're going to see how those work, because I don't know how they work. and we're going to do a comparison to how it works with, or how it compares to Azure DevOps. GitHub Actions, as much as I know, is like an equivalent to pipelines. It's a way to automate your code deployments. I'm sure there's more to it, so we'll find out. And then the third thing we're going to look into is DevSecOps, whatever that means. I have a general idea of it, but it's probably just some kind of way of integrating security into your DevOps processes. But what does that mean in relation to Azure DevOps? We'll find out. There's a bunch of extensions and stuff that we can do, we can install to make sure that our code is safe, secure, doesn't have anything that's against policy. It'll be pretty fun. And we have one final homework. I would suggest to take the AZ400 exam if you already took the AZ300. There's that application infrastructure rant that I kind of went on at the beginning. You really need to know the background Azure infrastructure and how it relates to deploying things. I was pretty nervous about taking it because it's just the weirdest one I've ever had. You need to have knowledge of like third-party applications. Like I don't want to say you need to know Jenkins, and I don't even remember if there was a question about Jenkins, but it's like knowing that you can integrate something like Jenkins is where you're going to be expected to have some answers. So don't freak out. You don't need to know how all these third-party apps work. You just need to know how you would go about integrating them. And also, if you're cool with failing's fun. You can fail it like 5 times in 12 months, and then you have to wait a year. So you get like 5 attempts at it, and always taking the exam is a good way to like kind of test your knowledge. I think all the things we covered on here were pretty close to the area that you need to know, aside from the fact that you need to have AZ300, I think. But yeah, I say just take it. Who cares if you fail? Try it again. You got 5 tries. You'll do it. I just happen to be okay on the first one, but usually it takes me a couple stabs at it. So that's your homework. Do it. If you want to talk about it, hit me up. I'll be happy to talk about it. But does anyone have any questions? Cool.
My great video. Let me stop the recording. I have
Okay.
a